Well, as you can see on the screen, Byron did a really good job of portraying what I was going to be talking about this morning, because this was how I was going to start my lesson. If you know anything about history, you know that Winston Churchill gave this speech in 1941, October 29th, at the Harrow boarding school in London, when he was talking there about what was happening in World War II. He gave this speech to never, ever give in. And he was basically referring to Nazi Germany and Hitler. As we know, in June 6, 1944, British and American forces invaded Normandy, and that was basically the beginning of the end of Hitler's reign. It's pretty much something that we remember as history, but I think it's also something that we need to remember as Christians. As we read that, it's a lesson for us. Never give in. Never give in. Never, 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 in nothing great or small, large or petty, never give in except to convictions of honor and good sense. Never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And of course, he was talking about Nazi Germany at that time. Who would we be talking about as Christians? Who is our enemy? Satan. How easy is it to give in? It's so easy. We're going to be looking this morning at three men that we always put on a pillar, a pedestal, you might say. That they were great men for the Lord. And yet they struggled. They struggled. The same as we are today. Discouragement is Satan's, one of his most effective strategies, is discouraging us. Let's be turning to Exodus chapter 14. We'll be looking at Moses. Of course, I think we pretty much all know the story of Moses and how he took the children of Israel out of Egypt, out of slavery and the bondage of the Egyptians, and how the people were just so appreciative of that, right? In Exodus 14, in verse 11, the people said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us out to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." Wow. A man that has brought them from slavery. And what are they doing? Complaining. We would have been better off in Egypt. We'd be better off dying there. Let's turn over a few pages to Exodus 16. Verses 2 and 3. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." They were really pleased with Moses, weren't they? Turn over another page or so. Exodus 17. Start in verse 2. So they quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses replied, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you not put the Lord to the test?" But the people were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled against Moses. They said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst?" They are never satisfied, are they? Let's turn over to Numbers 14. This is when they sent out the men to look at the new land, exploring Canaan. They came back and they were pretty discouraged about what they had seen. Numbers 14, verse 2. And all the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, "If only we had died in Egypt or in this desert. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and our children will be taken from us as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to be back in Egypt?" Now, if you were Moses and you had been with these people this long, would you pretty much get fed up with them? I mean, it seems like that's all they're doing, isn't it? Complain, complain, complain. What have they been promised? A land flowing with milk and honey. Not having to serve another country, Egypt. Not having to be slaves to them. And yet, what are they doing? Complaining the whole time. And I think a lot of times we can look at leaders and maybe possibly envy them because they have authority. But as followers, do we realize what kind of burden leaders have? These people had no idea what was on Moses. All they wanted to do was complain. I think today in the church, we have leaders in the church. And I think a lot of people do not realize what kind of burden those leaders have in taking care of the people. I've heard many elders talk about taking care of the church, shepherding the flock. It's not for the weak. Moses had every opportunity here to say, "You know what, I'm fed up with you. I'm done." But he didn't give in, did he? He didn't give up. When we look over in Numbers 20, in verse 10, we remember the first time that the people were thirsty. God said to take the staff that parted the Red Sea. He said, "Strike that rock and you will have water." And it did. Water came flowing. Here we read of a second time that the people were thirsty. And God told Moses, He said, "I want you to go and speak to the rock." Chapter 20, verse 10. Well, actually, starting in verse 8. "Take the staff that you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together, speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will pour out of its water. You will bring water out of the rock for the community so that they and their livestock can drink." So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence, just as he commanded him, and he and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring the water out of this rock?" Then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. Moses kind of gave in there a little bit, didn't he? He wasn't quite as strong at that moment. Because what did God tell him to do? Speak to the rock. But look what happened, as you see there. He and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring the water out of this rock?" He didn't include God there, did he? Just him and Aaron. Must we bring this water out of the rock? He left God out of the equation. And then he done it his way. He struck the rock. Do you suppose he regretted that? I think he did. And unfortunately, he paid the price, didn't he? He was not able to enter the promised land, the land of milk and honey. He could see it, but he didn't get to go into it. But he continued to serve God, even after making a mistake. If we'll turn over to Jeremiah 19, here's another man. Instead of being fed up, he was beat up because of what he did for the Lord. He was a preacher, preaching to a people that didn't want to hear anything that he had to say. The nation of Judah was going to collapse, and it was going to end up being captives to Babylon. In Jeremiah 19, verse 14 and 15, it says, Jeremiah then returned from Topheth, where the Lord had sent him to prophesy, and stood in the court of the Lord's temple and said to all the people, "This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Listen, I am going to bring on this city and the villages around it every disaster I pronounced against them, because they were stiff-necked and would not listen to my words." They wouldn't listen to him. And let's read in chapter 20 there, start in verse 1. Then the priest Pashur, son of Immer, the chief officer in the temple of the Lord, heard Jeremiah prophesying these things, and he had Jeremiah the prophet beaten and put in the stocks at the upper gate of Benjamin at the Lord's temple. He had him beaten and then put in stocks. Because what? Because he said something the people didn't like. He was prophesying God's words. Did he give in? Did he keep prophesying? Let's look down at verse 7. Jeremiah. O Lord, you deceived me, and I was deceived. You overpowered me and prevailed. I am ridiculed all day long. Everyone mocks me. Was he a little discouraged after being beaten and put in stocks? Sounds like he'd like to put in a letter of resignation, doesn't it? I'm kind of done with this. I don't want to be beaten anymore. I don't want to be put in stocks. I'm tired of proclaiming your word, Lord. I want to give in. I want to give up. But what does it say in verse 9? But if I say I will not mention him or speak any more in his name, his word is in my heart like a fire shut up in my bones. I am weary of holding it in. Indeed, I cannot. He cannot hold those words in, can he? He has to prophesy what the Lord has told him to do. It was close though, wasn't it? He was ready, like I say, I'm done. I'm being ridiculed. I'm being laughed at. No one wants to believe me. What were the consequences of them not listening to Jeremiah? captivity in Babylon. If they'd only listened. But they didn't. But Jeremiah kept on. He didn't give in. He didn't give up. Let's look at another example. David. David was the epitome of what a man would want to be. He was good looking. He was a king. He had power. He was a musician. He was a poet. He had beautiful wives, beautiful children. Everything a man would want, right? He had it all. But he wasn't satisfied. Not quite enough. If we look at 2 Samuel, we'll see what happens. 2 Samuel chapter 11. We'll see what happens when a person gets tripped up with things in their lives that go on. 2 Samuel 11, verse 2. One evening David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "Isn't this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" And we know what happens from there on, don't we? He goes and sleeps with Bathsheba. Bathsheba. She becomes pregnant. He tries to finagle it around to where Uriah would be the one that would be the cause for that, but that didn't work either. His plan failed there. So we've got to get rid of Uriah. So he puts him at the head of the heat of the battle. And basically Uriah is killed. And then he takes Bathsheba as his wife. He got tripped up, didn't he? Sin. Temptation. If we turn over a few pages to 2 Samuel 12, we see Nathan comes to him and basically tells him a story, and I've always been impressed with the way this turned out, because Nathan told a story to David, and David didn't like the way that story was going. He said, "It's wrong. This is absolutely wrong." We remember there was a rich man and a poor man. Rich man wanted to throw a party. The poor man had one little ewe lamb that he had raised and grew up with it. His children were with it. It says it was like a daughter to him. Traveler came to a rich man. The rich man refrained from taking one of his sheep, and he took the poor man's little ewe lamb. In verse 5 of 2 Samuel 12, it says, David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, "As sure as the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity." Then Nathan said to David, "You are the man." Can you imagine how David felt when it's put to him that way? If we read on down there in verse 13, then David said to Nathan, "I have sinned against the Lord." I have sinned against the Lord. David gave in to Satan, didn't he? He gave in to him. His lust, his passion took over. Then he had to lie. Then he had to murder. But did he really totally give in as a whole? He realized what he had done here. He realized the great sin that he had did against the Lord. We all know the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Make me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside still waters. Who wrote that? David. David was a man after God's own heart. We read in Psalms 42, we have a song that we sing many times, as the deer pants for the water. David wrote that also. In Psalm 63, the whole book, the whole chapter. O God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My body longs for you in a dry and weary land where there is no water. As we read on that whole chapter, he realized what he'd done wrong, and he got back in the good graces of God, didn't he? He continued on. Many times we will say, well, I would never, ever give in. I would never give in to Satan. And yet, how many times do we? How many times does he put discouragement in our path? How many times does he put our desires right there in front of us and says, just partake a little bit. It's not going to hurt anything. It's real easy, as Winston Churchill said, to never, never, never give in. It's easy to say that, isn't it? How easy is it to do? We've got three pretty powerful men here, right? And each one of them had a moment, didn't they? Where they didn't quite measure up. But yet, they came back. They came back to God. We're going to have days when we're not going to quite measure up. We're not going to quite have that fortitude. We're going to be fed up with it. We might be beaten up with it. I don't think we are physically beaten up for being a Christian in this country right now. But we can be mentally beaten up. I think one of the hardest ones is being tripped up. Just as David was. A man after God's own heart, and he still got tripped up, didn't he? Satan gave him that desire on that rooftop. We are going to face this every day as long as we are here on this earth. Satan is going to try to trip us up. He will put things in our path that will cause us to become discouraged. To say it's not worth it. I'm fed up with this. They may have given in at some point, but they never gave up. The Apostle Paul wrote in Galatians chapter 6. Starting in verse 9. He says, "Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Therefore, as we all have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of the believers." But what did he say? Do not give up. Let's not grow weary in doing good. Do not give up. When I was preparing this lesson, I was thinking of people that I know of in my lifetime that have given up. Literally gave up. I thought I'd do a little research. In 2022, in the U.S., 49,000 people decided to give up and commit suicide. 49,000 people. That is 1 every 11 minutes. Think of that. 1 in every 11 minutes. 2 have committed suicide since I've started talking. They gave up. They gave up. They gave in. In Idaho alone, 444 people committed suicide in 2022. In Idaho alone. $13.2 million people thought about doing it. 3.8 million people planned on it. And 1.6 million attempted it. That's a lot of people, isn't it? That wanted to give up. We have much more to live for, don't we? But we can be susceptible to Satan very easily. We can get discouraged. I didn't mean to end this on a bad note, but I think we do need to realize how important it is to always remain faithful to God. To always have this in the back of our mind, that we will never, never, never give in to Satan. Because he wants us to. Satan wants us bad. And as the statistics show, he's winning a lot of them. He's winning a lot of them. Unfortunately, they have no choice. The choice they've already made. But we today have a choice. Today is the day to make that choice to follow Christ. To have Him number one in our life. To have Him to live for and not Satan. If there's anyone here today that needs to make a decision to follow Christ, to put Him on, if there's anyone here that is struggling with sin, they're being tripped up all the time by Satan. It may be that secret sin that we think no one else knows about. God knows. If we're struggling, Let that be known as we stand and sing our closing song.